Welcome back, AP. All right. I know it's been a minute, but I like to kind of do weekly uploads during the summer assignment stuff, just because it gives me a chance to kind of go back over my material. It gives me a chance to kind of really make sure that the idea transitions inside these prezzies, so the flips are better, so everything's more fluid, so you understand it, so I get better test scores, and so we all win in the long run, right? But really, really love to see the view counters being up and everything on YouTube. Gives me hope and faith that y'all are actually starting to do your summer assignment ahead of schedule, which is a very important thing. You know what I mean? Like giving us a chance to kind of understand each other a little bit. And remember, y'all can email me at any time if you're concerned about the summer assignment, want to know more about some ideas that were expressed in the last flips. Anything y'all need, please let me know. Okay, so getting into it though, we kind of talked a little bit about a bunch of very abstract, big concepts that you might not be very used to dealing with in a regular history class in the last flip. But big thing going forward. I'm going to try to do this as often as possible. But let's kind of I'm going to scroll up a couple of ideas here real quick, just so you can kind of remember the things we did go over. So the things we covered mostly were the time periods of your AP European history. We covered where we are going to be studying the time is in modern Europe from about 1450 onward. We kind of briefly went over that placement on a timeline, kind of delineating European history into three separate phases, being antiquity, Middle Ages, and then modern era. We talked a little bit about antiquity, kind of some of the lingering gifts of the Greeks and the Romans. And then we talked about the Middle Ages and kind of how those things were lost to time after the fall of Rome, and they were kind of held on to in the Byzantine Empire for quite a long period of time. And then we kind of talked a little bit about as well the early Middle Ages being established, talking about the creation of the Frankish kingdom and a couple of other smaller entities under Clovis and Charlemagne. But the biggest part about that is the growth of papal power, right? The growth of papal power, and that's intertwining in its way into the government, right? The crowning of a king by a pope instead of being the acknowledgement of a religion by a king. So kind of setting up this idea of papal supremacy, which was a very, very big, important topic. Then we talked about the High Middle Ages, right? So art was coming back, learning was coming back, some other little things like that were coming back. And we started getting into a little bit more depth, considering, again, the Byzantine Empire still being around. But the big one was feudalism. The concept of feudalism is wildly important. You need to make sure you know that, okay? So, as I said, just kind of make sure you jump back, look over those things. You can watch the last flip on high speed if you want to kind of update yourself before we get into it. But let's go ahead and get started. Let's get into the nuts and bolts of this flip, right? So where we left off, we were talking about what do the early and the high Middle Ages really tend to kind of have in common when it's like a kind of just a composite theme. When we're talking about a theme amongst everything, what do they seem to have oh God, I know I'm sporting my LSU gear and everything today, and I'm really glad I got a chance to actually do this flip today, and because mainly due to the fact that I can't go outside because it feels like this outside.
I'm Mr. Heat Blister. I'm Mr. 101. They call me Heat Miser. Whatever I touch starts to melt in my clutch. I'm too much.
Yeah, so it's incredibly hot down here. I don't know how y'all deal with it. But then again, coming from Philly, I would much rather be hot than cold. The cold's awful. But anyway, like we were talking about, the Middle Age themes, right? What are the things that they both share in common? The biggest part about it is the idea that nobody's making money, which is a very big downside, right? So the big part about the Middle Ages is when you're really looking at it juxtaposed to the ancient Romans, the thing you're really analyzing is the fact that the economies were low. People were not making a lot of money. They didn't have structured tax systems yet. Not in the way that we think about them now anyway. They kind of had gotten rid of intercoastal trade. They had gotten themselves isolated as a continent, and they had kind of they wound up in what is known by many, which we would talk about more along as time goes on, under guys like Petrarch, this kind of idea of a dark age. So something that you need to understand is that when a great society like Rome falls, all of the amenities that Rome had went with it, all right? That is trade networks, infrastructure, aqueducts, ability of expansion, intercoastal economics, interterrain economics, large base trade routes that went with it as well. And when these barbarians were kind of realizing that they were like, oh, we can have kings too, like Clovis and Charlemagne, and we can have our own little states, and we can grow, and we can develop, and the Christian church began to expand, what that came at the expense of was the fact that economies were just basically nothing. Like, nobody was making any money, like, not in the grand sense that we think of it now. So getting on with it, you got to understand is that in the East, in contrary, from the years of 500 to 1450 AD, things were doing very well, all right? So some of y'all are probably like, wait a minute, Mr. Terry, what is the East? All right, so just so you understand, there are two spheres of history. There's the West, and then there is the East. We are talking more in a Western civilization right now, right? The history of Europe and its impacts on the world. Basically just the history of Europe in a sense. But Western civilizations encompasses Europe and its effects on the rest of the world, right? The Eastern civilizations include areas of Asia, particularly Southeast Asia, when you're talking about China, Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, that areas of Southeast Asia. And then also you can include India into that as well, and an Eastern civilization. Another big one is the rise of Islam in the Arabic territories out towards Saudi Arabia, Yemen, Oman, Syria, Lebanon, these other areas, Qatar, the Arabian Peninsula being the hotbed for the Islamic faith. And then also you've got the eastern coast of Africa being another big major player in Eastern civilizations during this time period. So you've got these two spheres. You got the East, you got the West, okay? Now, the West was going through the Middle Ages from the years of 500 to 1450 AD. And that means that they were making no money. Their trade was down. Their economics were terrible. They were not having liquid cash come in. And no, I don't mean actual, like, liquid. I mean, like, liquidated assets, okay? Whereas the East was killing it. Absolutely killing it. From the years 500 to 1450, you saw the Eastern empires growing at a monumentous rate. Southeast Asia, Africans, and the Arabic communities, right? So the Indian Ocean was that trade hub. The coastal area between, shared by all these areas, right? The Indian Ocean right there below the Arabian Peninsula, out towards Southeast Asia, and the eastern coast of Africa were a massive hub, home to goods that the world just absolutely today doesn't ever want to live without, all right? And that includes things like silk, intercoastal trade, well, that's a concept, scientific advancement and its ideas being advanced, right? Things like printing, paper making, gunpowder, explosive technologies, textile working, just like you're talking about a lot of different stuff being traded over this, right? Salt being one of the biggest ones. There is a phenomenal book called Salt that actually like talks about its movement and through the world history scope. But salt is a massively important good, right? It keeps people alive, keeps items preserved. Salt being traded mostly from Africa, coming from the African coast, actually was believed to at one point been worth its weight in gold. Literally, salt was equivalent. An ounce of salt was worth an ounce of gold, okay? So salt was being moved. Gold was being moved. Preservation of Greek and Roman teachings and artifacts were being held onto, mainly due to the fact that the Arabic communities during this time period had converted to Islam, and then they were growing, and they kind of usurped some of these items, and they translated them into Arabic, and the only reason that we have some teachings like Aristotle, Plato, or Socrates is because we've translated them back from Arabic into Western languages. So preservations of those teachings, philosophy, mathematics, algebra was invented. You're welcome. Spices were actually growing, and even like crazy things like the number 0. The Indian and Islamic communities actually contributed majorly to the advancement of mathematics with the invention of decimal places and the number 0 during this time period, right? 500 to 1450 AD. So you've got a massive expansion going on very close by, right down the road in the Indian Ocean from Europe. They're doing great. So why was the Middle Ages so bad, right? Well, like to continue further, just to give you another example, Muslim expansion was absolutely massive. Now, Muslim as in the expansion of Islamic practicing empires, right? So that's Islam and the rise of Muhammad. Muhammad showed up out of the desert in 610 CE or Common Era, as in 700 AD, right? Okay, so the expansion of the Muslim empire starts around the 700s, and they grew to this gigantic swath of territory, right? So you got the Indian Ocean down here where all this trade is going on. And you got Europe right there, isolated and away from the entire expansionary ideas, and also very, very far away from all this money that's actually on the grow and on the rise. A lot of it has to do with the Byzantine putting that wall up right there, right? The Byzantine Empire was still there, still very present, and still the money-making area. Because remember, this idea that all of Europe was just destitute, no one could read, is actually pretty farcical. The Byzantine Empire was kind of the torch, the guiding light of Europe still having intellectual activity and the ideas of ancient Rome still existing. So the idea that the Middle Ages was terrible for everybody is a little bit of an overstatement, right? However, the Byzantine Empire may have been doing well, but these Frankish kingdoms, Italy, Holy Roman Empire area, they still weren't reaping the benefits of this Eastern hub territory, right? But look at the Muslim empires growing at a phenomenal rate during this time period. Many people call it the Islamic Golden Age. They actually grew and expanded all the way to the south of Spain, right? So Europe was impacted directly by Muhammad and the expansion of his faith, or the expansion of the faith of Allah, right? So this, for example, is a trading post in Saudi Arabia, right? Notice the architecture. Notice the Muslim-style architecture. Notice the Islamic-style garb and clothing. These are Islamic kingdom residents, and this is apparently a very, very, very important area. However, look at this hub, this intellectual activity going on. And then you jump over here, and this is from the south of Spain. It's in Andalusia, all right? So look at the similar architecture. That, my friends, is a very important example of something you need to jot down real quick. It's called cultural diffusion, all right? I even put it up here for you. Even put it right there, just so you could write it down. Cultural diffusion is the spread of ideas through war or trade, okay? The spread of cultural traits. The reason why Islamic architecture is in the south of Spain has to do with the expansion of the Muslim territory. That is cultural diffusion, right? The reason why America is considered its melting pot, cultural diffusion, the movement of people here, right? The trade of goods. So every time you see the traits of a different culture in a different geographic area, that is cultural diffusion, the movement of those ideas, all right? It's a very, very important concept that we'll keep talking about multiple times as time comes around. So, but going forward, as you can see, the Eastern empires killing the game, absolutely crushing it. So what was the late Middle Ages and Renaissance then really? We talked already about the early Middle Ages and the high Middle Ages being kind of this moment for Europe to recollect itself after the fall of Rome, for the Germanic peoples, the Franks, the Huns, the Ostrogoths, the Visigoths, the Magyars, all these different people to come into former Roman territory and create cultures of their own, to create states, territories, cities, kingdoms. That's the word I was looking for. Kingdoms of their own, right? Spoken by their own languages. The Angles moving into what is now England, right? Anglish, Angland, right? So we talked about that a little bit on the last flip. So what are the late Middle Ages and the Renaissance then really? What are they? Why are they so different? Why is this the area where we're starting our study of European history that will be on the AP test? Why? A lot of people try to attribute it to the return of intelligence during this time period and the art and blah, 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 blah. What it really is, it's a return of money, all right? Money began to come back to Europe in full force. Europe finally got a chance to start getting its slice of that monsoon marketplace over towards the Indian Ocean, right? These goods started making their way back into Europe. And with that cultural diffusion, and with that economic trade, you saw the rebirth of a culture, fragmented, yes, by language, cultural traits, different ideas, different groups everywhere in Europe, but you saw the growth of a new modern era. You saw it's in its infancy, right? In the late Middle Ages, before the Renaissance began, you saw the return of commerce, finance, and banking. You saw the growth of all these things, right? Particularly in Italy, right? Italy being one of the biggest areas of this growth, okay? Now, some people say, oh, it's because the home of the Roman Catholic Church. And you would be right. Some people say, oh, it's the home of ancient Rome. It's where Rome actually was. It's their ruins are still there. Their intelligence, to a degree, is still there. That's why it came back to Italy. Some people argue, oh, well, they're the middle of the Mediterranean. They have a huge amount of trade that goes in and out of their borders, right? And all of these things would be right. All of those things are correct. All of those things contribute to the reason why Italy became like the beacon of the rebirth of intelligence and the rebirth of ideas of classical European history going forward. Now, that, my friend, is what the word Renaissance means. Very important that you write that down, all right? Renaissance is French for rebirth, right? That is what the Renaissance is. And so some of you are like, well, wait a minute, Mr. Terry, back it on up. And why do you have late Middle Ages and Renaissance? Because here's the thing. Like I said, nobody stood up one day and was like, ha-ha, the Renaissance. Like nobody actually did that. Looking back in time, we now label this era in history as the Renaissance of the Renaissance of Europe. So you had to understand that the late Middle Ages did see a rise in economics leading into the Renaissance, even though the late Middle Ages is defined by its horrific and violent nature sometimes. So we'll get there in a minute, though. All right, so let's talk really quickly how we got there. How did we go from we got no money in like the high Middle Ages, early Middle Ages, to now being a very prosperous area full of different peoples and different goods and different things and different languages in Europe by the Renaissance period? How did we get there, right? So Middle Ages all begins with the Middle Age money, right? How they were making money in the Middle Ages. And the way they were making money in the Middle Ages mostly had to do with taxation, land holdings, and some trade. All right. So during your early high Middle Ages, right? During the earlier phase of the Middle Ages, the way lords, kings, nobles, dukes, barons, all those guys, earls, that's my favorite title. There's a guy named the Earl of Sandwich, which they claim he invented the sandwich, but highly doubtable. But money was mainly held by them in the forms of taxation, mainly that going to the king and then being redistributed as according to that king. I'm actually reading a really good book right now. It's talking about kleptocracies, where like some kings like actually just keep it and steal it. So kleptomania, stealing. But land holdings is a big thing as well. Land holdings, in a sense, had kind of a liquid currency idea to it. The more land you have, the more reputable you are, the more titles you have, the more reputable you are, the more clout, the more influence, the more ability you have to manipulate the poor and the peasantry, right? So then another one was trade. But at the bottom of this list, you'll notice is trade. You'll note, like, the Frankish kingdoms following the Treaty of Verdun in 1842 were not doing massive amounts of trade. They were just trying to expand their borders, right? So, and the trade they were getting was like a trickle out of Italy, right? Now, usually, though, what is going to start finally happening, capital during the Middle Ages is going to begin to be reinvested. Profits are going to begin to grow. And a gap between the wealthy and the poor is going to start growing rapidly as well, okay? So that reinvestment of capital is really important. That is the keystone marker of a capitalist economy, the thing that's going to bring Europe out of the quote-unquote dark ages and into the Renaissance period, that period of rebirth, right? Taking money made off their land holdings and reinvesting it into their land, trying to grow their profits, is a very important thing to understand, because now you're seeing a growth of new ideas coming into Europe, right? That reinvestment. Capitalism is being born on its own, right? So now, something you got to understand, though, is feudalism, not a great place to keep growing capital, all right? So jot that down. Feudalism is not the best way to grow capital. Feudalism is not the best way to create a renaissance. Feudalism is a terrible way to create a renaissance, actually, because feudalism exhibits complacency, right? You've got a lord, and he's got some vassals, and he's got some serfs, and the serfs farm stuff, and they give some to the lord, and they give some to the vassals, and it's a little like the machine just keeps on turning, right? It doesn't grow wealth, though, in a large scale. That's where these things called the guilds came in, all right? The rise of the guilds. The guilds are very important. This idea of groups of individuals figuring out how to better a product, make it better, set their price. Well, okay, anyway. So let's talk about what a guild is. All right, what a guild is groups of people. Because many serfs, former serfs, remember what a serf is, not a slave. They're the laborers that are contracted to the land by a lord in the feudal system. They got to work there for X amount of time, like a lease, hence landlord, right? Now, as these serfs began to free up themselves from these contracts, as lords and began to acquire new technologies like plows and mills and had a reduced need for serfs and peasants on their land, peasants and serfs began to actually trickle into the regular everyday economy. They began to move out, right? They began to move off lord land and off noble land, and they began to apprentice under skilled workers, right? And as this system began to grow, because let's face it, if you're a former serf, right? If we've got like Olivia Stanfield used to be a serf, right, on one of the lord's lands, and now she doesn't have a job anymore, she's not just going to go knocking on some other lord's door and be like, hey, do you need help with work? No, she's going to try to figure out a skill that she can make more money with. So she would go and apprentice under somebody like Molly, and Molly would show her how to be like a blacksmith, and now you're forming a fledgling guild, a small guild. You are a group of workers who are sharing expertise in a trade, right? So they began to apprentice under skilled workers and form these big groups, these large guilds, to stop from competing with each other. Why? You can say this is baby capitalism. It actually has more, it shares more essence with like socialism a little bit, because they began to come together, right? These trade guilds began to come together, and they actually began to unite. They began to protect their business. They began to set the price of their product, right? To try and avoid unjust taxation, to avoid fines, and also to avoid being taken advantage of, because nobody wants to get into a bidding war, right? If you have certain guilds, you don't want other guilds trying to fight you for that money, right? So, for example, there are all kinds of guilds out there. There were the 7 major guilds of Florence, which we'll talk about later. That being like the wool merchants guilds, the banking and finance guild, the money movers guild. Like they're guilds defined by what they do. One of my favorites is carting guilds or printing guilds. Printing guilds are a lot of really, really cool too. They come up actually like around this time period, and they started like printing books and creating print shops, and they also start printing decks of cards and all kinds of other crazy stuff like that. So like now the United, skilled workers began to unite, protect each other, set a price on their product, and avoid unjust taxation and fines. This is going to stimulate the economy. More money is going to get made. There is going to be a lot of money being made by the guild system, right? So the guild system is going to show up, and people are going to start raking in the dough, just absolutely raking it in, okay? Now, what are these different, like, if you were to break guilds down into certain groups, you'd have 2 big types of guilds, all right? One of these guilds would be a merchant guild, and the other one would be a craft guild, right? Now, what I've been talking about this whole time, Olivia would learn under Molly on how to be a blacksmith, right? So that's a craft guild, okay? That's a skill. That's a specific thing. Don't count the merchants out. What is a merchant? Let's take a second to define that. Merchant is a person who sells product, right? They're somebody who moves product. They may own a boat, or they may own like a certain amount of vessels or have certain contacts in other areas, particularly out in the East where they trade all this good stuff that everybody wants, and they're the ones that go out there and get it, right? So you got craft guilds and merchant guilds. Merchants being the sellers of goods. Merchants also would work with craft guilds and actually sell their goods to third-party customers, charging a little bit of like for the movement of the good itself. Merchant guilds are very important, okay? Speaking of importance, out of these 2, which do you think actually grew the fastest? Like, which ones do you think began to dominate the scene and actually really, really grew really, really quick? Raise your hand if you said craft guild. Okay, I see you. Okay, see you. See you, Sheck Snyder. All right, okay. Raise your hand if you said merchant guild. That's right, all right? If you said merchant guild, you are correct, okay? Now, I don't blame you for thinking craft guild, because a lot of you are thinking, oh, they made the product. They got to be getting paid more for it. Merchant guilds began to grow extremely fast, because you're forgetting something, okay? You're forgetting the fact that these goods are right next door. They just got to go get them, right? So now I know a lot of y'all are like, oh, wow. So these common people began to go out there and they began to actually really rise up and take control of their own assets. Yes, okay, like to a degree. However, almost all of the wealth in Europe during this time period still resided with kings and lords and nobles and This was an Eastern product, actually. Coffee, all right? So, actually originally coming from the Arabian Peninsula. In northern Africa, the way they discovered it is because goat herders, actually, when they were walking by a coffee plant, actually started nibbling on these little things on this plant, which actually turned out to be the coffee grapes. And they would eat it, and they'd get all hyped up. And they'd be like, oh, man, if the goats freak out, maybe it'll keep me awake. And they started roasting the beans and then filtering water through it. Anyway, another time. All right, so now, anyway. So, however, almost all of that wealth still resided with the kings, right? The feudal lords and the church. They still hold the big bundle of the money. Like over 90% of the wealth of Europe still resided in these stagnated areas. However, this did not mean that these groups, kings, lords, and the church itself could not begin to invest in these guilds, right? So they could actually see their profits turn a little bit of a dividend. Now let's talk about really quick, why were these merchant guilds the ones making so much money? I just kind of loosely explained it a second ago. Well, the big reason why is because they can import and export those Eastern goods that we were just talking about, right? All that stuff that everybody wants. And I actually left a couple of them off that list because I like to talk about them a little bit more. They are the ones that started bringing in all these products right next door, right? They could go down to the south of Spain in Andalus and pick up goods from the Muslims, right? They could go to the Byzantine, and they could go to Constantinople and pick up goods from the Byzantinians, which were the still wealthy group of the Europeans that were still there. It was Rome. A lot of people were like, oh, Byzantine. Well, like the Renaissance era called them the Byzantine because they didn't want to look dumb. All right, like so, but we'll talk about the big Byzantine Rome debate later. If you actually want to write that down, be like, Mr. Ray, what do you mean by the Byzantine Rome debate? I'll explain it later on, but the Renaissance named the Byzantine. Everybody in Byzantine called themselves Rome. So anyway, but they had all this stuff, right? Spices from all over the world that everybody wanted to get their hands on. That right there is going to be the big good coming up. The big one. The one that's going to like push overseas exploration to all new heights. What do you think Columbus was looking for? He was looking for a way to find that, all right? So that's what he was looking for. Then he bashed into the continents. God, never mind. We'll talk about him later. All right, so anyway, the silk textile trade is going to be a big one as well, coming out of China. Actually, fun fact, a lot of only the Chinese knew how to make silk for quite some time until Indians and some Arabic people picked it up because they smuggled silkworms out of China. They went in there and stole them. So anyway, but silkworms are going to, like, of course, be making silk, and they're going to be trading that product. These two, big ones as well, though. Porcelain, all right? Chinese porcelain. Chinese porcelain being a translucent type of clay porcelain that has a very specific recipe to it, okay? It has got a very, very good tensile strength. It is beautiful. It is priceless, too. Like, Chinese porcelain is considered to be one of the best pottery-based goods the world had ever seen up until that point. And it took Europeans hundreds of years to learn how to make it. And it was all through trial and error. Some German guy was the final one that figured out how to make it. But the Chinese could sell this good for a lot of money, and people back in Europe would buy it for a lot of money. Hence, again, why these merchant guilds were growing so fast. And then here's a big one. Tea. Tea is going to be a huge good that starts making its way through Europe. Ironically enough, coffee was much bigger before tea ever got really big, but tea is going to come in major play during the 1700s when we talk about imperialism. But tea is going to also begin to move its way. And these are kind of luxury items, right? Are the regular people in Europe buying these from these merchant guilds? No. The kings, the lords, the church, they're the ones buying them, right? These luxury items, right? They considered them luxury due to the fact that they had no access to them. They considered these goods luxury items because they never had seen them before, and they finally began to trickle cultural diffusion all the way over into Europe, and that is going to be the resurgence. The beacon, the guiding light, bringing them out of the Middle Ages and going into the Renaissance has to do with the return of intercoastal economics, right? Actually, a big, big return of it. So going forward, another thing, warehouse inventory. None of this stuff goes bad. That's huge. Doesn't have an expiration date. Is Chinese porcelain going to go bad? Are spices really going to turn anytime soon? No, they're dried, powdered goods. Like, you can keep pepper, and as like some of y'all know, it'll get stale, but it's not going to go bad, right? Like, so they're not perishable items. Tea has already been dried and preserved, right? Silk doesn't have an expiration date on it. That's another great thing about it. That's why these merchant guilds were able to grow so profitable so quickly, okay? Now, then, with this whole time, what we've been talking about, in an essence, is the late Middle Ages. We've been talking a lot about late Middle Ages, the growth of this economy, money coming back. We haven't hit the Renaissance yet. But in the late Middle Ages, going into the 1300s, you're seeing the growth of wealth return to Europe. You're seeing a massive amount of growth come along. But then the late Middle Ages began to just hit one crisis, terrible, or tragic event, one after another. And it sent Europe back again a couple hundred years, right? A lot of historians argue had the late Middle Ages not played out the way they did, the Renaissance itself could have theoretically started as early as the 1100s, right? Some historians argue that it could have been the 12s. So, of course, this is like neither here nor there. But terrible and tragic events began to play out. Things like climate shifts. That's right. They had a mini ice age during the Middle Ages. It was absolutely wild. Led to crop failures and famine, right? So famine, 1315 to 1317 saw a massive famine period where actually huge crop yields failed all over Europe. And nobody is buying squat. It doesn't matter if you're a lord or a noble or a king, if your people are dying of disease and famine, right? So the famine actually, I think it wiped out somewhere in the neighborhood of like 5% of peasants in the entirety of Europe. That's absolutely wild. Some of you are like, well, 5% is not that bad. Well, when it's coupled with wars between nobles, which these other people are like, the regular people are dying, the 100 Years' War being something that played out throughout the late Middle Ages as well. And then, of course, you know, the Black Death. That was a pretty big deal. 1347, that hits Europe, all right? The Black Death being carried by what else? Merchant guild ships coming from the city of Kaffa, right? So the way that the Black Death hit Europe was due to the fact that merchant guilds were on the rise. Had the trade not come back to Europe, the Black Death may have never made it to Europe. But the Black Death made it to Europe because these merchant guilds were moving product from the eastern territory, from the eastern civilizations, back into the west again, right? And Kaffa was a very, very important small city. All right, so yeah, Kaffa apparently is located off the coast of Crimea. It's in like southern Russia. And Kaffa was a very, very important port, which was going to be bringing goods back into Europe. Well, that same port city of Kaffa was attacked by these people known as the Mongolians. All right, so when the Mongolians invaded, they actually had already known about the Black Death, and so they actually purposefully launched dead plague bodies at the city. And we believe Patient Zero was somebody trying to run away from that city as it was being attacked by the Mongolians, probably had on him a flea from one of those bodies. That flea bit him, and he began to be the first person to start spreading Black Death throughout Europe, right? But also, the movement of vessels and the movement of boats carried these little guys, right? So rats are the ones blamed for the spread of the plague, when actually it has to be the fleas on the rats, because the fleas on the rats are the ones that bite the rats, transferring a bacteria called Yersinia pestis into their mouth, right? And in flea saliva, there's an anticoagulant. Anticoagulant means your blood doesn't clot. It's how you get scabs. And so when the fleas would actually show up and bite other people, that saliva would be regurgitated into people's bodies, spreading that bacteria, which causes the Black Death plague. Yersinia pestis, right? So I love talking about the Black Death. It's something I get to talk about with the West Civ kids a lot, but we can't spend too much time on it. So Babylonian captivity is going to be another big holdup. So from 1347 to about 1350, you've got the Black Death ravaging throughout the entire world at that point. You've got 30% of the population of Europe dying. 30%. Write that next to the Black Death. 30% of the population of Europe dead from the Black Death. Absolutely wild. That coupled with the famines, the 100 Years' War, and all these other climate shifts. And then another really crazy one is Babylonian captivity. Not tragic or terrible in the sense that you would think of it that I've been talking this entire time, like leading to human death. Babylonian captivity was just kind of weird. Babylonian captivity was coupled with the Crusades and was actually a big thing that has to do with multiple popes, okay? So there was a period in European history known as the Great Western Schism. And the Great Western Schism occurred when there was a fight over who would be pope. What ended up happening was two popes claimed authority because one of them was trying to be discredited, and it led to this thing known as the Avignon Papacy. And y'all will learn about the Avignon Papacy a lot with Mr. Mathern this year. I will make sure that he teaches that to you well. But Babylonian captivity, or the Great Western Schism, which is something that we'll also keep bringing up from time to time, is a big example of corruption in the church because, like I said, there were multiple popes, and countries began to just side with whatever pope that they thought would benefit them the most, right? So anyway, the big thing about it going forward, that was unexpected. Back to the types of guilds. There we go. The big thing that was really unexpected, though, is something crazy happened. It did not crush Europe the way that you would think it would. You would imagine the tragedy of the late Middle Ages would then lead to a downward spiral, and the Renaissance wouldn't begin until the 1600s. So what was it about the tragedy of the late Middle Ages that actually stimulated economic development? Because that's actually what ended up happening. Economic development didn't slow. It leapt forward, absolutely leapt forward in a huge way. And a lot of historians have tried to grapple with this, but the big leading theories behind it are, one, that the disruption of the manorial system led to nobles losing money, right? And if the nobles are losing money and funding, that money has to go somewhere, right? So as that money began to move into the hands of private and individual citizens, now you've got a re-stimulated economy. But the disruption of the manorial system, and as they lost money, also let more serfs and peasants go. And as they moved out, they began integrated into the guild system, and they began to bring money back. Disruption of the church is also going to be another one as well, which led to the papacy losing money. Again, reintegrating itself back into the regular European economy. Now, less people also. So Europe had a huge population boom during the Middle Age period. You wouldn't think it would, but it did. So less people and less restriction led to smaller markets, keener competitors, and higher wages, right? So if there are less people competing for jobs, there are more people employed, and also, not to mention the fact that there are more people making more money because these guilds are now becoming more exclusive, all right? So actually, the economy leapt forward after the Middle Ages, after the tragedy of the late Middle Ages, and that is where we're going to stop this flip, okay? I'm going to be coming back to you in about 2 seconds, though, because I think I'm going to upload 2 of them today, all right? So I'll see you guys then.